They're making significant gains. Far-right parties in Europe are adapting their agendas, with many seemingly adopting more mainstream policies. What is behind the shift, and will the change in tactic help them win more political support? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Bah Thibault. He's a man who once said he doesn't hate Muslims, but he hates Islam. And though he's lost support in his own country, the Netherlands, that hasn't stopped far-right politician Geert Wilders from trying to take his message abroad. On Monday, Wilders was in the German city of Dresden, giving a speech that was supposed to give a boost to the anti-Islam movement Pegida. But despite a lot of hype from the organizers, the controversial Dutchman failed to draw a big crowd. In his speech, Wilders spent a lot of time mocking German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and in particular her recent remark about Muslims belonging to Germany. This was Wilders' response.
It's
a disgrace that you are not warning against this. We've had enough of political correctness. We've had enough of the Islamization of our society.
But Wilders isn't entirely representative of right-wing groups in Europe right now. For example, look at France's National Front Party. It has become one of the strongest political parties in France, and its success has been largely credited to its leader, Marine Le Pen. She's the daughter of the group's founder, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and she's been redefining the party, pulling it away from her father's views and closer to the center of the aisle. This past week, Marine publicly criticized her father because he said Nazi death chambers were just a detail of World War II. She said Jean-Marie Le Pen seems to be in a downward spiral somewhere between a scorched earth policy and political suicide. She said his status as honorary president does not give him the right to hijack the National Front with vulgar provocations. While Marine Le Pen also forced her father to drop his candidacy in upcoming regional elections, and he's complied, but not gently. Here's what Jean-Marie Le Pen had to say.
I think I'm the best candidate for the National Front, for many reasons. First, because I already had 33% in European elections and managed to get 5 parliamentary seats. Because I've been the president of the group at the Regional Council for 2 mandates already. But listen, if I need to sacrifice that for the future of the movement, I will not be the one to cause it damage.
So, is Europe's far right going mainstream, and will their new ways win over public opinion? Let's get the views of our guests today. Joining us in London, Petros Fassoulas, Vice Chairman of European Movement UK. In Paris, Franck Guillory, Editor of Jol Press, France's first e-magazine of international news. And also in London, Alan Mendoza, founder and director of the Henry Jackson Society. Gentlemen, thank you all. Welcome to Inside Story. Petros Fassoulas in London, if I may start with you. Many of these far-right parties in Europe now, including the National Front in France, UKIP in the UK, are ditching their traditional tactics and softening their images. But do you think it's for real, or are the changes just cosmetic?
I think they realized that it was necessary to distance themselves from their past identity, which tended to be racist and far to the right of the political spectrum, exactly because they want to have a wider public appeal. At a time when the electorate is getting a little bit disappointed with mainstream parties, they're looking for alternatives, and these far-right parties, by rebranding themselves a little bit, are appealing to a lot of people who are disappointed, let's say, with mainstream political parties. But like you correctly pointed out, I think in the background their DNA hasn't changed to that large extent. Gifted politicians, even if they're populist, like Mr. Farage or Madame Le Pen, are able to project a different image, but that doesn't change the nature of the party they represent itself, which remains far-right and extreme in many of its positions.
Franck Guillory in Paris, Marine Le Pen has turned the page on the National Front's anti-Semitic and racist past, and she's rebuilt it as a mainstream anti-European, anti-immigrant party and also a protectionist party. Do you think it's worked in France? Has she made the National Front more respectable today?
I don't know if we can say that the National Front is more respectable. What is sure is that the National Front these days in France is responding to, there's a demand. They actually decided to give their own specific answer to very specific issues such as globalization and multiculturalism, where actually mainstream parties didn't seem capable of giving accurate and modern answers. National Front brings some answers that actually can attract people who feel disenchanted and also scared by the unprecedented crisis that we're going through.
But you say that you don't necessarily think that the party has become more respectable, but nonetheless we hear and see Marine Le Pen today defending Jews, defending gays and women. Isn't that respectable in some way?
Well, no, respectable. I think it is cosmetic on this aspect. But what is true is that Marine Le Pen is not her father, who was first elected in 1956. When we heard last week Jean-Marie Le Pen talking about Marshal Pétain or going back to the Second World War, it was completely unadapted to our times. But Marine Le Pen brings a more open vision of what could be extremism and far right.
Alan Mendoza in London, do you agree with Petros and Frank, who say that these changes that we're seeing within far-right parties in Europe are only cosmetic, that we're seeing a resurgence of the same old far-right, albeit dressed in new clothing, that the DNA of these parties hasn't really changed?
I think, firstly, we have to be just careful in our definitions. I mean, you mentioned UKIP in the same breath as the Front National. UKIP, although I'm no fan of UKIP, it's not set up in the same way that the Front National was originally done so. Equally, there are other parties in Europe, the Swedish Democrats, others who are, openly neo-Nazi in terms of their actions. So I think there is almost like a spectrum of populist right parties that exist in Europe. Certainly those like the Front National that are trying to get away from their past, there are big questions as to whether it's cosmetic or real. I think, only time can tell. Certainly the fact that Jean-Marie Le Pen is still around, even if he's been quietened by his daughter, indicates there is still some attachment to that very nasty past that we have seen time and time again. It's going to take, I think, some time for the jury to settle on where this current incarnation of the party is. And until that jury is settled, I think we have to be very suspicious of it.
Do you think that, some people have said that this danger that far-right parties represent the dangers are sometimes being exaggerated? Would you agree with that?
Well, I think there is a danger from a disaffected section of the population who feel that, as was stated earlier, the mainstream parties are ignoring them. And when people feel ignored, they seek desperate measures sometimes. Now, it's fine if they're going to be supporting parties in the political process. What we don't want to see, though, is, of course, violence that often accompanies far-right parties from spreading in society and actually ruining social cohesion between communities. I think that's where the far-right parties are particularly dangerous, because they tend to breed this sort of aggressive form of populism with them that leads to violence and violence attacks on other citizens. Right.
Petros Fassoulas in London, how do you explain that Geert Wilders, the movement that he tried to bring up in the Netherlands, how do you explain that it didn't work in the end for him? And even in Germany, there seems to be no one really following in his ideas, and this movement hasn't really worked. Why is that, do you think?
Probably Wilders wasn't smart enough, or perhaps took it a little bit too far when it came to the rhetoric that he employed. He moved too far into the realm of racism for the taste of the Dutch people, who are... Holland is a very liberal, open society, and I believe that Wilders just didn't appreciate the mood and the extent to which his message became divisive. The interesting thing when it comes to parties like Mr. Wilders and others is not so much their appeal in the wider population, but their ability to push the debate and push mainstream parties towards their own agenda. And this is something that several far-right parties across Europe have in common, not least the Front National and UKIP. They might not be able to seize power in themselves, but they're able to push those that hold power towards an agenda that perhaps resembles more their own. And that's the real danger. When you hear mainstream parties repeating or replicating the rhetoric, that is when we really have to get concerned about their influence in the dialogue.
This is somewhat what's happened in France a bit, Franck, hasn't it? I mean, you increasingly see the right in France, the UMP party, adopting some of the same ideas and same policies as the right-wing National Front.
Yes, but not just UMP, actually. You know, the whole political spectrum is affected by the rise of the National Front, as it was said previously, because the National Front is setting the agenda. Yeah. I think also what has changed
Frank,
is that,
just before you continue, what do you attribute the rise of the National Front to in France? Is it because perhaps French society is becoming more intolerant with diversity today?
Not just this, I think that we are going through unprecedented difficult times. You know, last time was 80 years ago, and we had the 1930s, and we know exactly what happened. History is not necessarily repeating itself, but we've got to learn from history. If you're faced with such crisis as the crisis that we've been facing for years, first the financial, then economical, then social, societal, identity crisis. And if the mainstream political leaders don't answer to the fact that people are scared and disenchanted, then obviously they will look somewhere else. And in France, they decided to look to the far right. In Greece, they're looking to the far left. And they're looking for different answers. But what has changed that we can't just go in the street and say, well, the National Front is fascist and down with the fascists. No, it's not anymore this. We've got to answer and to fight politically, taking all different bits of their program and saying why we believe that they are not respectable, why their policies are not respectable.
Alan Mendoza in London. France says that, you know, people are Frank says people are turning to the National Front in France because they're scared. Is this the same in the UK? I mean, if people, I look at the latest polls, and UKIP is predicted to do well in the upcoming elections, 8%, I believe. But is this why people are turning to UKIP in the UK? Is it because they're scared?
Well, it's a combination of factors, as Frank has suggested. I mean, fear perhaps is one sort of motivation. It might be fear of immigrants taking jobs, this sort of idea that people are coming here taking jobs from indigenous people. That's one argument. It may be that part of the echoes of the crisis of capitalism are playing out. This is almost where the far left and far right meet, actually. You get a lot of discourse now from far left and far right parties talking about a better economic deal. And it's clear that there's been some economic pain, and some people have reacted to that by lashing out, if you like, by supporting extremist parties of both far left and far right, has been pointed out as well. The other issue that matters, I think, in Britain and in some other countries as well, is a sort of feeling about the European Union. The way the European Union is unfolding is unpopular to many people in Britain and in many other countries as well, and people feel that the main parties are signed up, if you like, to the agenda. Even if in the case of Britain that's not the case, nonetheless, you know, parties have seen the opportunity and they have tried to, if you like, steal that slice of the vote by pledging to leave the European Union, for example.
Well, last year marked the first time that three far-right parties came first in EU nationwide elections. They were the National Front in France, which also won 25% of the vote in recent local elections, UKIP in Britain, which is currently polling as the third most popular party in the UK's upcoming general election, and the Danish People's Party, which is also Denmark's third biggest party. Petros in London, do you see this trend continuing, these parties becoming increasingly popular? Could we envisage that in the coming years we could see a far-right leader like Marine Le Pen in France becoming head of state?
I wouldn't go that far. Democracy in Europe is remarkably mature, and despite the difficult times we're going through economically and politically, in many ways far-right parties have reached their ceiling. It is imperative, though, that mainstream parties do two things. First of all, confront the far parties on the left and on the right of the political spectrum, because up until now they haven't been put under intense scrutiny. So they need to be confronted. And the other thing, to echo what was already said, is to provide answers to the really difficult questions that electors around Europe have. And for far too long, mainstream politicians avoided discussing them, not least the effect of immigration and free movement around Europe, which clearly is something that troubles a lot of people, but it hasn't really been tackled seriously by mainstream parties. As long as those two things are done, I think we will see a receding of the influence that the far left and far right parties have. And of course, if the economic conditions improve, that will certainly take the sting out of the rhetoric. But it is imperative that mainstream parties take them on head-on and challenge their rhetoric.
Right. Frank, do you agree with Petros, who says that it's very unlikely that Marine Le Pen could become one day head of state in France?
It's unlikely in 2017, but you know, you never know.
But her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, came very close, you recall. Jean-Marie Le Pen came very close, you'll recall, yes, against Chirac.
In 2002, yes, was the second ballot of the presidential election. The difference between Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen is that Marine Le Pen really wants power, and she's now getting in position to get some power at local level, and therefore she will get better quality candidates, she will get better quality team, and she's here to stay, and the National Front is here to stay, but the conditions are not here for National Front to reach power at national level so far. But clearly, it will influence the political life, political game in France for a very long time.
Alan, what about in the UK? Are conditions ripe, if you will, for a far-right leader like Nigel Farage to come to power one day or become one of the main opposition leaders in the country?
Well, we have a pretty unique electoral system that almost certainly prevents that from happening. What we have to do in Britain is you have to have strength in depth rather than across the country. So even though it's true that UKIP are currently polling third in the polls, their strength is diffuse across the country. It isn't concentrated. So it's likely that in the coming election, the Liberal Democrats, who will probably poll much less than UKIP, will actually end up getting many more parliamentary seats than UKIP. It's just the way the system works. In a sense, our system has always been a good guard against extremism. If you look in the 1930s, we didn't have communists or fascists in Parliament. Again, it was because of the political system here.
Petros, there's a lot of people have drawn parallels between the situation today and the political extremism of the 1930s that eventually led to the outbreak of World War II. Do you see parallels between the current situation and then?
Superficially, perhaps you do, but there is a fundamental difference. Today we have the European Union, and it has been around for a long time. It's a club that has brought together 28 nations, European nations, in an intense process of cooperation. And perhaps some of the things the EU does are not particularly popular, but it has done one thing. It has removed the possibility of conflict between sovereign states in Europe, and that in itself is an enormous achievement and a guardian against the temptation sometimes of nationalistic movements and the conflict that they might produce.
But when you hear the anti-Islam rhetoric that exists today in some European countries that is not hidden anymore, doesn't that worry you sometimes? I mean, isn't it the same rhetoric that we heard back in the 1930s against Jews?
Certainly, to a large extent, one has replaced the other, even though anti-Semitism is still there and quite pertinent in many European countries. But as I mentioned earlier, if you see the way people are responding to this kind of movements, there's still a small proportion of the population. We should be careful not to fixate too much to what a party that represents perhaps 10 or 15% of the population and the extent to which they can promote extreme rhetoric. The vast majority of Europeans don't associate themselves at all with the kind of language used by anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim politicians who are just using this as an opportunity to put the blame on someone at a time of crisis and concern for a lot of people. I do believe that they need to be confronted, and they certainly need to be called out for what they say and what they do, but we shouldn't overestimate their ability to influence a large portion of the European population.
On the same idea of this anti-Islam rhetoric, tell us about what it's like in France in the wake of course, the Charlie Hebdo attacks and so on. Has it become now more common and, you know, has it become okay, if you will, for lack of a better word, to be anti-Islam?
I don't think so. I think there's especially post January terror attack. There was a sense, there's questioning about some perversion of Islam which leads to terrorism, but there was a very accurate answer by representative of the Muslim community, but also representative from the states, you know, to say, no, it is not Islam, it is. And actually Marine Le Pen is not going so much for the anti-Islam or Islamophobic speech, actually. And that's certainly not the reason why 25% of the French voters voted for the National Front at the local election. It is not so much about Islam. But I wouldn't be as optimistic as Petros Fassoulas was on the fact that EU would prevent us from any kind of repetition of history. Because, you know, who would have thought, for example, that Alexis Tsipras could become Prime Minister of Greece, right, you know, on a far left agenda, for example. So everything is possible. You just have to be careful.
Alan, can there be a common European response, do you think, to right-wing extremism or even left-wing extremism?
Well, it's difficult to have a common response because I think, as we've identified throughout the programme, there are different forms of extremism in different countries. Right. If you take what's happening in Greece, for example, it's different to what's happening in Hungary, it's different to what's happening in Germany, it's different to happening in France, and so on and so forth. So the idea of a common approach is going to be difficult to achieve. I think the one message from all this is, though, that it's about mainstream political parties responding to some fears. Now, some fears are clearly overblown and, you know, crazy. So the idea that Muslims are bad, for example, this is nonsense and has to be debunked. But of course, the idea that radical Islam is a problem for our societies in Europe is a very real problem, a very real threat. And in order to head off what the far right are trying to do, we've got to address the real problems and not allow them to take us onto the imaginary problem territory. Right.
What is the best response, in your view, Alan, to this growing support for right-wing parties? Because, as Alan mentioned there can't be a common European response because it's so varied depending on the countries. Petros, sorry. So what do you see as the best response to the growing support for right-wing parties today?
I think confronting them honestly and addressing the real issues that seem to be behind their popularity is the best answer here. Often the reason why parties like that flourish is exactly because they have filled the void in the public debate, and they have been able to provide easy solutions to really serious problems. So the answer here is taking on the rhetoric and providing the solutions that are necessary to address some of the economic, social, and other problems that our societies face. And once that is done, we will see their influence diminish significantly.
Quickly, Alan, you mentioned radical Islam, and I do want to touch on that briefly. You say this is the main problem today for Europe, radical Islam. So how then do you deal with it?
I'm not suggesting it's necessarily the main problem, but it is a real problem.
Right.
And you've seen, obviously, problems of radicalisation. You've seen some of our citizens in various European countries going abroad. There are fears about social cohesion. Look, it's a multi-pronged approach to how you deal with this. There's two main prongs to it, though. The first prong is the official response in countries, making it quite clear that radical Islam is not to be welcomed in our societies. And that can go through a variety of different approaches to try and obviously boost more moderates, to try and ensure ensure that radicals are not included in discussions or receive money from the government in that kind of place. But the second approach has to be, of course, and is happening in the Muslim community. Muslims themselves are saying, this is not Islam that we recognise in the slightest. We have nothing in common with this. But the next stage is for Muslims themselves to actually drive out the radicals and say, you're just not welcome here in our communities anymore.
All right, that's a whole other discussion and debate, of course. Thank you so much for taking part in this edition of Inside Story. Petros Fassoulas in London, Franck Guillory in Paris, and Alan Mendoza in London. And thank you as well for joining us for another edition of Inside Story. You can get in touch with us. Go straight to our program page at aljazeera.com. Post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can also tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly Bah ThibaultGuests, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.